The 20th century had been marked by the escalating of the fishing killing of common men by one another in war. The unfolding political and human crisis in the Horn of Africa during this century attracted the attention of the world. The intriguing conflict, which had been smoldering for a long period of time in the Horn of Africa, erupted as Somalia invaded Ethiopia's Ogaden province. This led to a unique war in Africa, which has had an unprecedented practical impact on the continent that has not been seen since World War II. As an area without obvious physical boundaries, the Horn of Africa is somewhat difficult to define precisely. In present and in past times, this has contributed to long-standing conflicts. Politically and internationally, the Horn is known as the area comprised of 4 states: the Somali Republic along the east coast of the Indian Ocean, Djibouti an enclave at the southern end of the Red Sea, Eritrea adjacent to Djibouti, and Ethiopia in the center. The conflicts of the existing frontiers on the Horn of Africa can be traced as far back as the European scramble for African territories in the early 19th century. The European powers formed treaties with one another but continued to not recognize the demarcation of the Horn of Africa and continued to fight over it. Ignoring this issue, they continued to colonize the Horn of Africa. Somalia was divided into Italian Somaliland and British Somaliland, and Italy tried to take over Ethiopia but was ultimately unsuccessful. In 1941, Haile Selassie, the imperial emperor of Ethiopia, triumphantly returned to Ethiopia from exile. Haile Selassie began a relentless campaign for the consolidation of personal power and the expansion of the Ethiopian state. The British, having betrayed the Somalis for reasons of enhancing power, wealth, and influence, had yet another precedent for doing it again. They immediately recognized the throne of Haile Selassie, and during 1942 the emperor continued to fight to restore full sovereignty of Ethiopia and to regain the pre-war boundary between Ethiopia and the British Protectorate. An agreement was then approved granting the British temporary administrative authority in the Ogaden region. The emperor pressed on with his ambitions to regain total control over the region. Finally, in 1948, the British gave up control of the region, but still retained residual rights of supervision over Somali clans pasturing in the region. This now marked the Ogaden region as part of Ethiopia. Conflict evolved around the issue of who should be regarded as an Ethiopian subject in the region. Somalis clung to the hope of ultimate diplomatic action to recreate a unified Somalia. Since there was no positive response from the British, the Somalis immediately staged mass demonstrations throughout the protectorate, demanding recovery of the lost land, and for the first time demanded the right to become independent. The British were left with 2 options: either fight or leave. In Kenya, they had fought for a while, but the endeavor was not fruitful. Therefore, they decided to leave the Horn of Africa. On the 26th of June, 1960, the British Somaliland became an independent state. 4 days later, the Italian Somaliland achieved its independence, and the two were united by a hastily formed treaty. On March 1962, Somalia broke off diplomatic relationships with Britain. It is important to note that the British nurtured the idea of Greater Somalia. During this period between 1961 and 1967, Somalia continued to support the insurgent movement known as Shifta in the region, in search of liberating the lost land. However, its meager economy could not sustain the country's badly needed development, and therefore there was political turbulence. On October 15, 1969, Somalia's parliamentary democracy came to an end with a dramatic suddenness. President Shamarke was assassinated in the northern portion of the country, an area alleged to have been involved with major electoral frauds. Prime Minister Igal, who was out of the country, hastened his return to Somalia. However, before the dawn of the 16th, Mogadishu was in the hands of the army. After this coup d'etat, which brought President Siad Barre into power, the Soviet Union emerged as the dominant foreign power in Somalia. Perhaps because of their failure in Egypt, their move in Somalia during this period might be termed as yet another attempt to regain and maintain influence in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, or they could have been motivated to counter the American influences in Ethiopia. So, the Soviet Union signed a friendship treaty to equip Somalian defense forces, and in exchange, the Soviets were allowed to improve and use the air and naval facilities in the ports of Berbera, Kismayo, and Bosaso. After the fall of Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974, the military government that took control was riddled with many fighting factions. Senior officers in power were eliminated one after the other until Major Mengistu Haile Mariam emerged as the true leader of the Derg and head of the state of socialistic Ethiopia. The economical and political status of Ethiopia was clearly in chaos. The acute rise in the price of fuel added inflationary pressures in the cities and in urban areas. Meanwhile, in parts of the highlands, above all in the provinces of Woro and Tigray, a murderous drought consumed the countryside. Because of this drought, oxen and cattle died, there was no grain harvest, and there was no food. The people started dying in tens, then in hundreds, and eventually in the thousands. In late February 1977, the United States decided to cut off military grant aid to Ethiopia as part of a protest over the treatment of dissidents by the Derg. Faced with serious domestic opposition and a cutback of U.S. aid, the Derg began to search for alternative sources of financial support. On April 23, 1977, Ethiopia ordered the closure of the U.S. Embassy. Less than a week later, the United States announced that delivery of nearly $100 million already appropriated dollars for Ethiopia would be stopped. Mengistu wasted no time in courting the Soviet officials on the topic of continuing military aid. He met with Foreign Minister Gromyko and President Podgorny in Moscow in early May 1977. Although the contents of the meeting were not made public, it was evident that an increase in military aid was discussed. Immediately after the meeting, there was an increase in presence of Cubans in Ethiopia. The relationships between Soviet Union and Somalia started experiencing upheaval as it became clear that Ethiopia was leaning towards the east in the name of socialist dogma, and more so the arrival of arms to Ethiopia from the Soviet Union.
The Soviets moved into Ethiopia to assist the communist dictator there, Haile Mariam Mengistu. I thought that this was a threat to the stability of Africa.
President Siad Barre seized this opportunity. Between 1976 and 1977, Somalia infiltrated enough Shifta guerrillas to establish firm bases in the Ogaden region. At 0600 local time on July 23, 1977, Somali armed forces, supported by tanks and aircraft, crossed the common border into Ethiopia. The invasion took the Ethiopians by total surprise, and by July 26, 1977, 10 major towns in Ogaden were captured. By August, about 90% of Ogaden was in the control of Somalis. On the 14th of November 1977, Ethiopia launched a major counter-offensive supported by the Cubans and the Russians, who had been flown into Ethiopia prior to the invasion. In fact, Russia's Army General Vasily Petrov, at that time first deputy commander of the Soviet ground forces, is reported to have planned and directed the operations. Skirmishes between the two opposing forces continued, both sides suffering a number of casualties. Finally, on March 10, 1978, the Ethiopians had reached the Ethiopian-Djibouti-Somali border. On March 15, 1978, all Somali troops had crossed back into Somalia. A truce was reached with the pressure from the superpowers. During the 1970s, no area of Africa underwent more sudden and startling internal upheavals and foreign policy than did the Horn of Africa. As a result of coup d'etat in Ethiopia and Somalia, power was in the hands of new leadership who were bent on policies that forced the Soviet Union and the United States to rethink their stand on the Horn. The deteriorating political and economical situation in Ethiopia's Mengistu regime offered a golden opportunity to Somalia to enhance their dream to fulfill the greater Somalia. Since the national boundaries were drawn by colonial powers without regard to geographical and ethnographical considerations, the Horn of Africa will continue to experience boundary disputes. The Ogaden War is just an example of wars or skirmishes to be expected in the future.
The Horn of Africa was not important to America as of itself, but it was important as a measure and a test of how the Soviets were interpreting detente.